This time our topic is Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory. This theory emphasizes the social influences on psychological development. So Erikson was concerned with dyads and triads, families, and larger groups, including peer groups, concerned with the influences of culture, institutions, and environment on psychological development. Erikson expands on Freud's psychosexual stages in terms of content. He has a wider focus, has a wider range of central issues. He expands the number of stages and the timing of these stages to include development over the entire lifespan. So for Erikson, psychosocial development occurs from birth to death. His 8 stages of development are epigenetic, meaning that they are thought to unfold according to a predetermined plan in a certain order. And the central focus is identity, or identity development, versus the drives that were the focus of Freudian psychosexual stages. For Erikson, there's a psychosocial crisis, or a central set of issues at each stage. And these are normative stages or phases, again with one central issue at each stage, and the developmental task is to master this issue. Outcomes can occur on a continuum with problems in either extreme of the continuum. So there's a wide range of healthy outcomes and problems at either end. So for example, the first stage, the issue is trust versus mistrust. There's a wide range of healthy outcomes in the middle, but extremes of being too trusting or too mistrustful could be seen as problematic. Ego qualities, or virtues, emerge from mastery of these developmental tasks, but unresolved issues can be carried forward and revisited later on. The 8 stages of Erikson's theory are shown here. The first 5 stages map directly onto Freud's stages of psychosexual development. So for Freud, the first stage was oral development, where he focused on the expression of pain and pleasure through the mouth. Erikson calls this infancy, and for him, the central issue is the development of trust versus mistrust in the caregiver. So this is related to some of the same issues that Freud was focused on, issues of feeding and care of the infant in the first year or year and a half of life. And while Freud focused on sex, aggression, libidinal energy, the expression of pleasure and pain, Erikson recharacterizes this, reframes this as a dyadic issue or broader issue of trust or mistrust, also related to care and feeding and communication. He says that the virtue that is produced by the resolution of this stage is hope. Now, why is that? Well, the idea is that if the infant emerges from this stage with some trust that her basic needs will be met, then she's hopeful about the future. If we're not sure that our basic needs will be met, there is no hope. So again, the ideal outcomes are not trust, pure trust, that's not the ideal, but something on a continuum from trust to mistrust, with the idea that there are sometimes reasons to be skeptical or mistrustful. The second stage, Erikson calls early childhood, runs from about 1.5 years to 3 years and maps directly onto Freud's anal stage. In early childhood, the central issue is autonomy versus shame and doubt, according to Erikson. So again, thinking of parallels with Freud's anal stage, for Freud, the issue was toilet training and development of self-control, a sense of will, a sense of ownership of one's body. So Erik is reflecting those issues here in thinking about the development of autonomy, a sense of will. But it's recast in a much broader frame. So here the issue is, will the child develop a sense of her own self or be ashamed and doubtful about her own abilities? If there is some sense of autonomy, the child goes forward with a sense of will, free will. The third stage maps onto Freud's Oedipal or Electra complex. But here, look at how Erikson has recast this. It's a play stage. So Erikson focuses on the important activity of play in development. Here the central issue is initiative versus guilt. So in the play stage, the child is learning to do things with objects, building towers of blocks, for example, developing fantasy play, playing doctor, lawyer, house. And here, children begin to initiate their own fantasy play, their own building structures, using their imagination. So building on autonomy, on a sense of self, moving forward to initiate activity with others. And the idea is that if a child doesn't have confidence in her ability to initiate play and fantasy in a purposeful way, she will feel guilty. The fourth stage is early schooling. Freud called this the latency stage, but there's, as we've said before, a lot going on here. The school age, Erikson describes as an issue of industry versus inferiority. So now we're building from trust to autonomy to initiative to industry. What's the difference here? What's the difference between industry and initiative? Well, in the play stage, children begin to show initiative in developing fantasy, play, and building structures, and so forth. In the school stage, there is more emphasis on production, accomplishment of tasks. So not only do we initiate activities, but we complete them. We learn basic math skills, for example. We learn to read. So there's a sense of production in schooling. There's also a sense of comparison to one's peers, and that's why the contrast here is inferiority. So children get a sense of what they can do, what they can accomplish in school, in part in comparison to others. So the negative pole of this continuum, inferiority, means feeling incompetent, lacking confidence in one's ability. Adolescence is probably the most important stage in Erikson's theory because this is where identity formation is central, and identity formation is the central issue here. So Erikson thought that adolescence is the key stage for identity development, and without a clear sense of identity, young people can come away with a sense of role confusion. The virtue gained at this stage is fidelity, fidelity to self and to others. And then in young adulthood, Erikson focuses on the issues of intimacy versus isolation. So the idea here is that one needs to have a sense of identity, of sense of self, in order to be in an intimate relationship with another. And in the absence of intimacy, one will feel isolated. The virtue that is gained here is the virtue of love. But Erikson said that for women, stages 5 and 6 are reversed. Now remember, Erikson's writing in the 1960s when there were very traditional views of gender roles. So Erikson said that women actually don't find themselves, don't develop a strong sense of identity until after they have developed an intimate relationship with a man, a heterosexual romantic relationship, and begun to experience the roles of wife and mother. So after becoming a wife and mother, the woman finds her identity. It's clearly sexist and heterosexist. This is an idea that that is largely rejected nowadays. The adult stage runs from about ages 34 to 60, and here the central issue is generativity versus stagnation. So the idea that adults focus on creating things, giving to the world, generating either care for the next generation or generating in the workplace, and the sense of production, of giving back, of doing useful work is important here. Without that sense of generativity, there is stagnation, says Erickson. Generativity can be in the workplace or it can be in the home. It can be in volunteer work. It's not necessarily related to employment. And the virtue that comes from this is a sense of care for others, for the next generation. And then finally, in old age, the central issue is sense of integrity versus despair. And by integrity, Erickson means that in old age, people tend to look back at their life and say, have I had a good life? Do I have a sense of that my purpose has been fulfilled? Do I have a sense of pride in how I've lived my life? Or a sense of despair that I didn't have the opportunities I wanted, or I didn't live up to my potential? So this is a central theme toward the end, with the virtue of wisdom hopefully coming out in the end. Now you can raise lots of questions, and we will raise lots of questions about these stages. One that I would point out now is whether it's true that these issues really arise only at the particular stage in which they're mentioned. For example, I think the issues of integrity are ones that we encounter much earlier in life. We often think about our integrity early on. Now, maybe it is a central issue in old age, but that doesn't mean it doesn't arise earlier. And similarly, issues of identity come up in early childhood and throughout life. Maybe they are central in adolescence, but they also occur throughout life. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts about these stages. One of the central issues for Erickson is identification. And he said that children identify with part aspects of people. You can think of this as part objects in object relations theory. And Erickson talked about mechanisms of introjection and projection. So he is using ideas from object relations theory and ego psychology. He also talked about the choice of a negative identity, meaning that sometimes people will choose to act out in negative ways, perhaps because they don't have other options, but to take on the role of a heretic or a rebel. Erickson also talked about the psychosocial moratoria that occur in adolescence. And he said that adolescence is a very interesting and unique time in our lives because we really absolve adolescents from participation in regular society for a while. So we give them this psychosocial moratoria, a space in development where they can find themselves and experiment with who they are and what their role will be in society. This is ritualized, and there are institutional supports for the psychosocial moratoria. Rituals include bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, formal recognition of the passage from childhood into adulthood, and emerging conceptualizations of adolescence and young adulthood as special times for development in which the young person really needs to focus on who they are and what they will become. One example of this is the tradition of Rumspringa, an Amish tradition, in which young people are given a period of time, I think it's usually 3 years, to explore. Rumspringa, I think, means running around. So there's a time when young people are out of school, they're not expected to work, they're expected to go find themselves. And all bets are off. There are no rules. Adolescents can do anything they want. And they often leave traditional Amish communities and go into the cities and experiment with drugs and sex and all kinds of things, and they decide whether or not they're going to come back to the Amish community. The expectation is that if they do come back, they're there to stay, and they're a full-fledged member of the community, and they're sort of really granted all rights and privileges of an adult. If they don't come back, that's also a permanent decision. They're not coming back. Are there other ways in which the psychosocial moratoria are provided to adolescents in our cultures? What are some critiques of Erikson's psychosocial theory? Well, he specifies age ranges for each stage, and these age ranges appear to be inaccurate in some ways. Some of the ranges are very wide. For example, one stage spans the ages of 6 to 11, and there are an awful lot of differences between 6-year-olds and 11-year-olds. So you could say there are many subphases within that stage. Adolescence is thought in Erikson's theory to range from 11 to 18 years of age. And again, there are huge differences between 11-year-olds and 18-year-olds. Adulthood ranges from 34 to 60. That's a very wide range. So this seems rather imprecise. And we'll talk in a minute about other theorists who suggest that there are specific substages within Erikson's stages. Another critique is that a sense of identity or sense of self may not be stable over time or across situations. Some postmodern theorists have argued that we really have multiple selves, that we are different selves in different roles. And they question whether a stable identity is possible or even desirable. What do you think? So let's talk about some ways in which these stages have been expanded. Adolescence can be viewed as two distinct developmental stages. And many theorists have split the adolescent phase into these two stages. Early adolescence is when a sense of group identity is thought to form. So early adolescence involves deciding which peers are most important and deciding what kind of peer group one will join. Kids use all kinds of terms for different groups. So there are jocks and nerds and geeks and the cool kids, and various terms for different cliques. But the idea here is that kids join cliques and they first decide who they identify with, and then in later adolescence develop a sense of individual identity within the group context. In adulthood, the stages have been expanded by Levinson. His book is called The Seasons of a Man's Life, focused on research on male development in adulthood. But he identifies a number of sub-stages in adulthood that are focused on building structures in one's life and changing those structures. So the structures here are work or career or family or lifestyle. So in early adulthood, we develop some structures. They might be around college or around early career or early family formation. And those structures typically change and give way to other structures, new jobs, different career paths, different stages of life in the family. So we're constantly building and changing structures. Levinson's focus on middle adulthood is what gave rise to the idea of midlife crisis. Now, Levinson did not mean that this was a crisis at all. His work has been widely misinterpreted. He just meant that in midlife, we typically evaluate the structures in our lives and say, is this working for me? Is this structure that I've built in my life, my work, my family, my friends, all of it, is it what I want? And the midlife issues, I won't say crisis now, for Levinson had to do with a reevaluation of those structures. He thought that in midlife, this reevaluation is really important, and that people typically say, look, if these structures aren't working for me, I really need to make some changes because this is going to be the last chance I have to create a life that works. And that's why, in some people's thinking, we see divorce in midlife, we see career changes. People are actively deciding that their life structures need to be reevaluated and reconfigured. What are some limitations of Erikson's theories? Well, they're based on very male models of development. They're quite explicitly sexist in some aspects, particularly this idea that female identity development depends on monogamous heterosexual relationships with men. They're fairly narrow assumptions about family composition. This was based on assumptions that children were raised in two-parent heterosexual families. Erikson repeats the middle class and upper class and Western biases that we've seen in other psychological theories, with an emphasis on individualism, autonomy, and separateness. He doesn't consider the family life cycle influences on development, or what's called the cogwheeling of generations. So he's looking at individual development. So development of one person through the 8 stages really can be contingent on the development of other people in the family. So for example, the development of an adolescent might be influenced by the ages and stages of the adolescent's other family members. Erikson doesn't take that into account. We will consider that when we come to family life cycle theory in a couple weeks. Erikson also does not consider development of racial, ethnic identity, or issues related to sexual orientation. And given how important identity is in Erikson's theory, that seems to be a major omission. So let's look at those special issues in identity formation. There are theorists who have focused on these issues explicitly. So for example, in the development of racial or ethnic identity, we know that children are aware of race and ethnicity very early on. This is not something that's new in adolescence, but that in early childhood, children are aware of differences in skin color and meanings attached to that, and different ethnic groups. Dolores Norton, who was a graduate of our PhD program at Bryn Mawr College and was my instructor in theoretical perspectives in social work, developed a theory about the dual perspectives on identity that children in minority groups develop. This is a very useful idea, I think. She said that children in minority groups, and she was focused mostly on Black children growing up in the United States, develop a dual perspective on identity, meaning that they understand who they are within their own subculture. They understand how they are viewed within their social group. And they also understand that that identity is somewhat different in the majority culture, that the majority culture views them differently, perhaps in negative or in pejorative terms. So they have this dual perspective on their lives and role in society. Norton thought that was a developmental advantage because minority children understand in a very deep and personal way what culture means. They understand that how they are viewed depends on the lens people are looking at. And this is an understanding that majority children do not have. So she thought this was a very good adaptive perspective that helps minority children thrive in racist and oppressive situations. Similarly, there are a series of theories about identity formation in relation to sexual orientation. So, since identity issues are important in adolescence, and there is a lot of exploration in adolescence about sex and sexual orientation, this is really important, particularly for gays and lesbians, bisexual and transgendered youth. And there are stage theories that deal with the development of identity formation for homosexual gay, lesbian, and other youth. So Cass, for example, in the mid-1980s, proposed a 6-stage model of identity formation for homosexuals. Kimmel focused a model on adult development of gay men, and Lewis developed a stage model of identity development in lesbian women. You could read about these stage models. They're fairly epigenetic models. They focus on the unfolding of a sequence of stages in a particular order. The order is fixed, and that's somewhat problematic. It's not clear that people really go through these stages in that order. But it's interesting that people have said, wait a minute, we need more explicit ways of understanding identity formation outside of a typical heterosexist, heteronormative model. What are some of the strengths of Erikson's theory? Well, it emphasizes social influences on development, the influence of the family, the entire family, the extended family, the school. It explicitly considers influences of the peer group and wider social groups. It identifies some central psychosocial issues in development, and I would argue that these issues are important. Whether they're salient at one particular time or not, it can be debated, but these issues arise and can be revisited at various points in the lifespan. So to that extent, to the extent that Erikson has identified a series of important issues, I think that's useful. The resolution of developmental tasks is not absolute, so that it's not a matter of success or failure. It's not a matter of healthy or unhealthy development for Erikson. The resolution is some point on a continuum. And I think that's useful. The idea that there is a wide range of healthy developmental outcomes is useful. And the idea that development continues over the lifespan provides a rather hopeful approach. We are never done. Development continues into old age, right up to the point of death. What are some uses of this theory in social work? Well, it can encourage age-appropriate expectations of children, youth, and adults, as long as we are flexible about our views of these stages or phases, as long as we understand that the age ranges are approximate. We can consider where people are in relation to normative developmental tasks. So this provides an important context for assessment of development and developmental psychopathology. We can use this approach to focus on mastery and growth. What are the tasks that people are engaged in? What are the developmental tasks that are appropriate now? What are the areas in which people need to work? And we can also use this to encourage life review, particularly in old age. So some of the oral history projects, for example, focus on using narrative or narrative therapy to engage adults in a review of their life, and that has some adaptive value. So that's it for now. I look forward to talking with you about these issues.